Welcome, everyone. Believe it or not, this is our 24th session of learning Mishnah together. And specifically, we have been doing a very deep dive into a sequential reading of Pirkei Avot after an introductory class last year on Mishnah, where we studied comprehensively Mishnah Shabbat as a kind of guide to learning how Mishnah operates. We've now been in Pirkei Avot for, actually, I think the better part of a year. Just a couple of housekeeping details. Our course will continue every Thursday morning at this hour. Please tell a friend to come. It's open. We try and make it so that anyone who is dropping in for the first time will not feel adrift. I do my very best, and I think the material is itself rather approachable. So please tell your friends that they're always welcome to come. Some people have asked, can I bring a friend? And the answer is, I would love for you to bring a friend. I would love for you to bring somebody who's not a friend, and maybe at the end of our study they'll be a friend. Also wanted to share with you some nice news that I just received my copy of this recently published book. It's called No Time for Neutrality: American Rabbinic Voices from an Era of Upheaval. I am published in this volume. It is a collection of rabbinic writings and specifically preachings or sermons from the latter part of the last decade. So it goes chronologically. Rabbinic remarks from 2016 up until 2021. So I'm actually the lead-off sermon in the book, so it's a really nice collection. I'm enjoying reading through it. It's about 400 pages, and many of my friends and colleagues are also collected in here, so there may be a few other rabbis whom you have encountered. But very grateful to my friends Michael Knopf, who's a rabbi in Richmond, Virginia, Rabbi Art Green and Rabbi Jill Jacobs, who wrote the preface and the foreword. And it's available online at probably Amazon is your best bet. It's called No Time for Neutrality, and again, collection of American rabbinic voices from an era of upheaval. So something to keep you engaged and certainly thought-provoking. Soul-provoking as well, which is the whole point of any good preaching. It should be both thought, soul, and also heart-provoking. Speaking of which, Pirkei Avot. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We are studying together Pirkei Avot chapter 3, starting with Mishnah number 10. I will bring it up on screen. This is the second set of teachings attributed to Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa. That's odd. Hang on for a second. My tabs got a little bit screwy, so just one moment. I have to go back and relocate the correct tab. Here we go. Hanina ben Dosa. And just as a reminder, this fellow is a second-generation Tana. Tana in Hebrew is a word for a teacher. It is actually the Aramaic form of the word, of the same root as the word Mishnah. Shins and tavs are interchangeable one with the other when you are flipping back and forth between Hebrew and Aramaic. So and Steve Siegel wrote, what about moreh? Moreh is another word for teacher. You know, they say you learn a lot about a language from the words that are, or from the clusters in the language that are duplicative, right? So the old saying about Inuit people, which is the correct term for what we formerly called Eskimos, which I understand is understood as somewhat disparaging in the Inuit community. So the indigenous populations of the Alaskan territory have like 50 words for snow. Okay. So Jews have like 50 words for teaching and learning. Should not surprise us. We also have similar redundancies in words for law and justice and judgment and righteousness. So none of these things should really surprise you, but it reinforces for us what we already know to be true, that ours is a tradition that prizes and emphasizes learning, teaching, law, justice, and righteousness. And many other areas too, where you'll find duplicative words within Judaism. Whereas in general, actually, Hebrew tends to be a much more compressed language. I'm using that word to mean that usually, relative, for instance, to English, which is a much more expansive language, Hebrew has far fewer words to convey wide ranges of meaning. So a single word conjugated perhaps differently or manipulated to convey different nuances or placed in different contexts, one single word usually means lots of different things in Hebrew, whereas in English, there are usually individual, specifically nuanced words that can, separately deployed, convey a wide range of meaning, right? My general philosophy of writing and preaching is that there's usually one best word to convey one's meaning. And that if you spend enough time and craft choosing your words carefully, you can do an excellent job of honing in on a very precise meaning. In Hebrew, some of the fun and the richness of the language is in the multivalent, or the many meanings of a single word. But notable exceptions when it comes to the subjects of teaching, learning, justice, righteousness, and law, Hebrew tends to be prolific in its nomenclature. Many, many different specific words, meaning law. We don't even have all the different words for law in English that correspond to all of the many different Hebrew, biblical, and rabbinic words that mean laws of various sorts or types. Okay, that was a long digression. Nevertheless, it was a way of saying that no more, or lihorot, which is another verb from which the Hebrew word for teacher, who is a more, maybe you had to go to Hebrew school and refer to your teacher in the masculine as more, or if it were a she, as mora. Mora comes from the verb lihorot, which is another word for teaching that is not related to lishanot, from which Mishna is taken, and then morphed in Aramaic into the word tana, which means also to teach. Hanina ben Dosa is a Tana, which means he is an original teacher of the Mishnah, or a Mishnaic era teacher. Second generation Tana, approximately traced to the middle to latter part of the 1st century of the Common Era. You can actually see that in the capsule bio off to the right-hand side of the screen. It's pretty visible on my screen, but it's smaller print. Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa lived before and after the temple's destruction. He was known for his piety, his faith, and his ability to petition God. In this regard, the greatest scholars would turn to him to pray for them. He lived on next to nothing and experienced many miracles on behalf of himself and his family. The only reason we, quote-unquote, know that is that these miracle legends, or these folkloric accounts, are recorded about this rabbi, as folkloric accounts are recorded about many of the rabbis in literature outside of Pirkei Avot, right? So he's referenced in Pirkei Avot, but he is also referenced elsewhere in the Talmud and the Midrashic literature. Again, this is one of the loveliest brand new features of Sefaria, where one can just kind of click on the text itself, and a tab comes up. When you click on the name of a rabbi, Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa, his bio comes up, and then you just click the X here, and it goes away. I say this because you can use this tool without me guiding you through it. You can just go to sefaria.org and engage with this wonderful, incredible online resource that just gets better every single time I encounter it. Or you can click on the Mishnah itself, such as this, and you see a tab now comes up where you can read commentary, law or halakha, Kabbalah, Jewish mystical thought, other Jewish philosophy or thought, translations, places where other rabbis have used this text on text sheets or teaching sheets. It's just an amazing resource. Every week I make a pitch for Sefaria just because it relies on community support for its funding model. So if you really want to make a tzedakah contribution to somewhere, of course, we'd love for your tzedakah to come to Westchester Reformed Temple. I wouldn't hesitate to say that. But if you'd like to support an under appreciated organization, give to Sefaria. They serve the Jewish people, and they make this rabbi very happy and fulfilled. So, we have all of this different commentary. It's now, they've reformatted this so that you can do it all on the same inline thing. There's lots of goodies here that we can look at, but we'll come to that later. So Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa was actually introduced to us at the end of last week's session. We looked at this text. It was one of the more, I think, plainly evident texts to interpret just on its surface meaning, so we don't need to recap it. Let's pick up right at 10. Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa, he used to say, Hu haya omer, Kol sheruach habriot nocha hemenu. Okay, so this is we're going to encounter some really hard phrases to unpack and translate today, but we'll do our level best. Kol sheruach, the words are simple, but the meaning is hard. Kol sheruach habriot nocha hemenu. One with whom men are pleased. Ruach hamakom nocha hemenu. All right, this is a weird phrase because it's a good idiomatic translation. I support the translation, but idiomatic is the key. Literally, kol, meaning all or anyone, sheruach habriot, literally the spirit of creation. Ruach is a spirit, wind, or breath. There's a great example, by the way, of a single Hebrew word with vast numbers of meanings, right? Ruach. We use ruach to mean spirit in the sense of like team spirit or college spirit, or a rowdy group of kids can be praised for having ruach. Ruach, however, is also the first word associated with God's breath in the Torah. It is also the word associated with the way in which God shows up even before humankind is created in the first chapter of Genesis, in the first paragraph, as it were. The Ruach Elohim merachefet al pnei hamayim. The Ruach of God was hovering, merachefet, or flittering, floating, al pnei hamayim, over the surface of the waters. This was when the world was still tohu vavohu, or chaos, wild and waste, or formless and void, depending on your translation. I think formless and void is your King James. So ruach is the wind, the breath, the spirit. Spirit is a word coming from breath, by the way. That's where you get respiration or inspiration. To inspire is both to breathe in and also to put wind in the spiritual sails of someone. So lots of fun with words here. Kol sheruach habriot, and briot from like borei, as in borei pri hagafen, that which is created. Briot are creations or creatures. So all sheruach habriot nocha hemenu, anyone with whom the wind of the created things are pleased with that person. This is a very weird phrase. I mean, why didn't they just say people? I'd love to unpack that. I haven't been able to hit on an answer. Why do we use this strange phrase to mean people? It says one with whom men are pleased. Men is not a great idiomatic translation here. I mean, it means people, but it is phrased in a really weird way. Anyone with whom the wind of the created is pleased. Ruach hamakom nocha hemenu. Literally, hyperliterally, the wind or the spirit of the place. Hamakom. Makom is another one of those Hebrew words with so many different valences and meanings. Most plainly, makom, this word here, is a word that means place. A makom is just, it's a locational word. It means a place. However, it is often applied, particularly in the rabbinic literature, to mean God. In which case, the best translation I offer for makom is usually the omnipresent, the one who is always in the place, or the one for whom it is always true, the adage, wherever you go, there you are. right? So there's God for you, the one who wherever God goes, there God is. Hamakom, the one who's in place, or the central location, or the omnipresent one. And ruach again, meaning wind, breath, the animating spirit of. Ruach can also mean soul sometimes, like that which is not bodily manifested or corporeal, but rather um, spiritual, from spirit, soul. So if the ruach of the created is pleased with with one, with a man, with a person, then the ruach of the makom is also pleased with that person. And we'll just unpack this before we get into it. I'm giving a lot of the grammar, syntax, and vocabulary here just because I think it's so rich and layered that you can't have a full appreciation of this text without the Hebrew. I'm always cautious. I don't want anyone for whom Hebrew is not only not a native tongue or even a secondary tongue, but really intimidating. I don't want you to get lost here, so don't be embarrassed. And Steve, I see your hand and I'll acknowledge you momentarily. V'chol she'en ruach habriot nochahem. And unfortunately, there is a really simple structure to this Mishnah so that you can unpack it logically. Anyone for whom the ruach habriot, again, meaning it says men are displeased, but it's much more nuanced than that. Anyone for whom the spirit of the created is not pleased. Ein is a word that connotes the negative. In ruach hamakom nocha himenu, then God will not be pleased with that person. So again, there's the simple meaning is actually fairly easy to unpack. If other people are pleased with you, God is pleased with you. If other people are not pleased with you, then God is displeased with you. And by the way, simple to translate, very sophisticated sentiment that we will again unpack. Let's stop there because now we are introduced to a different rabbi, one Rabbi Dosa ben Harkinas, and he's not the same as Hanina ben Dosa. So Steve Maskett, why don't you take the first lead in speaking here?
So I actually didn't mean to raise my hand, but I was because I didn't know what it was just doing. Anyway, I'm thinking about this that it's like what is the mathematical concept of commutative? If this is this, then it's the other.
I don't know. I'm a words guy.
It feels like the ruach of everything is the same as the ruach hamakom, as if God is everywhere, as if everything is God, and there's a sort of very sophisticated concept of God there, I think.
Yeah, wonderful, Steve. Thank you. And my disclaimer is that one of the reasons I became a rabbi was my atrocious skill at math. You know, when I was a kid, I was the kid who had a poster of Carl Sagan in his bedroom. I thought that I was going to be an astrophysicist, and then I realized that there's a ton of math that's involved with that. Most science, in fact, is very mathy. So I'm a words guy. But yes, I think your observation is quite correct. I also want to acknowledge the complexity of a question or a kind of a comment like the one Audrey sent me in the chat window, in which she said, how does that account for a well-liked tyrant? In other words, is this just one big popularity contest? Is all that it takes? I mean, one could logically extend the argument to ask, is all that it takes for God to approve of you or to earn God's pleasure or displeasure how you are regarded by other people? That's a very good question. I think it's a question that the text begs for us to explain, and I'm not going to give my answer yet because I actually hadn't contemplated that question until Audrey asked it, but I love that question. We also have a question in the chat window. Is it the spirit of man or people driving this, or the spirit of God? Right? I mean, remember, like, the overarching theme of Pirkei Avot is what is the meaning of a life well lived? Or even more, I think, Jewishly expressed, what and how does one earn God's favor in life? So this cuts to the core of it, and it seems to suggest that primacy should be placed on how one is regarded by one's fellow, perhaps even above how one seeks God's direct approval or pleasure. That appears to be um, that appears to be um, animating this text. Mom and Dad, I see your hand. Would you comment here?
Well, I was just going to agree with Audrey's comment, but not to turn this into a political discussion, but can anybody think of somebody who's wildly popular among tens of millions of people who might not necessarily gain the favor of the divine one for that person's actions?
Great. Right. Michelle, why don't you chime in? You put a question in, and I would love for you to elaborate. But you have to unmute. Yep.
No, that wasn't the problem. As I went to do that, I realized I forgot the point. I was responding to something. Shoot.
Okay. When it comes to
sorry.
no problem. No apology necessary. We should always be very forgiving when thoughts come and when thoughts go. It's one of the things I've learned to accept through my meditation practice, is that thought is very hard to control. And it's not a sign of anything other than that you're a person when your thoughts kind of like float in and float out. We had one more comment in the chat window from Russell. Is the answer that it isn't in favor in the eyes of man that matters, but rather in the eyes of those created in the Spirit of God? Russell, elaborate on your meaning here. I think I'm following, but it would be better coming from you if you're able to unmute and chat with us.
Well, you translated for us a text where it and unless I misunderstood, it is referring, in fact, to those created in the Spirit of God.
Great. I mean, that is a possible read on this. And I wanted to draw attention to the strange way in which the Mishnah is phrased, because I think if it just wanted to say, anyone with whom man is, let's use the gender inclusive man, which is not really au courant these days, but we can use it knowing our meaning, and also knowing that this is not a congregation of millennials I'm teaching today who would get up in arms about my use of man to include people who are not biologically or gender identify as male. Okay. So anyone with whom man is pleased, God is pleased. Anyone with whom man is displeased, God is displeased. That would be that's basically what Safaria gives as the translation. Most other translations of this Mishnah go in the same direction. But my point was that when the Mishnah wants to use a generic word for man or person or people, it has ample choices that mean just that. The phrase Ruach HaBriot, it is a really leading phrase. And so if Russell is correct that this contains, and more than just implies, it actually states directly something to the effect of ones in whom the image of God are created. Well, then you have a very different, maybe there's even a moral valence to that. Is that where you're leading us?
Yes, that is exactly it.
Right.
And that is, before you judge someone, decide what your own motivations are. Are you acting with a moral purpose, or are you and another way of looking at it is, if you cannot displease your fellow man and expect that your piety will still be favorable to God. You can't be a miserable person who is universally reviled, but think that your private piety is enough to earn God's favor, and vice versa.
Excellent. Excellent. And by the way, there are a few other notes in commentary that one can look up. Some of them are fairly obscure, and some of them exist only in Hebrew and not in translation. I did spend some time with them, where it seems that they wish to translate what Safaria just kind of reduces down to, well, we're talking about people versus God, so let's just use man and God. But then you've really reduced or erased the beautiful and potentially highly significant nuance of the deliberate way in which the rabbis phrase this Mishnah. They translate it as something along the lines of what I did: the spirit of creations, take pleasure, find pleasure, or that which is created with spirit, meaning those who are godly. So we're not just talking about any man or any woman or any creation or created. We're really talking about those who specifically are attentive to the divinity within, or the capacity for a human being also to be an expression of the divine.
Imbued with the Holy Spirit.
Imbued with the Holy Spirit, exactly. And by the way, no surprise that Christians would also lean into the idea of spirit as one of the many ways in which God's presence is encountered on earth, is not only through the incarnate Christ, which was the bodily incarnation of God, but also through this thing called spirit. The Christians didn't just pull that out of a vacuum. I know that the phrase Holy Spirit is almost always overlaid for us American 21st century lay readers with Christological overtones. I would say, well, it's indigenous to Judaism. Dad and Mom, Michelle, any further comments? Acknowledging hands here.
I was wondering if the root brit or habriot that's in here, does that have anything to do with covenant?
False cognate.
The same root?
Yeah, false cognate. They sound a little bit alike in English, but they are not related in Hebrew. So brit covenant, briot comes from, so brit, I'd have to go back and look at the grammar on that, but I think that the root is bet resh tav, brit, and briot, the weirdly it drops, but the root is bet resh aleph, like borei pri hagafen is the actual root of briot.
I'm having a lot of trouble with the sentiment though here about someone who's loved by man is also loved by God. How many episodes in history and science, for instance, of views that were reviled,
Right.
that turn out to actually be the way things are.
So remember that this is one rabbi's opinion amid a multitude of rabbinic opinions and wise sayings that some later rabbi or rabbis, generations later, has compiled, redacted, and included. And in that context, I would say, not trying to apologize for the text or to erase the discomfort that I think you acknowledge emerges from the text, and I think it's a reasonable response, and I wouldn't have chosen to spend quite this much time on one sentence of Mishna if I didn't think that it were worth the time. I do. I would suggest that, remember, we've been reading a lot of texts directly leading up to this. You do have to remember back the last 2 weeks that impose a kind of rigorous piety on the young, budding yeshiva bocher who will be a rabbi, right? Remember, audience and author here, by rabbis, for rabbis. The context also matters. The context is the destruction of the temple, the deep, sustained, widespread trauma that had been inflicted on the Jewish people, first at the destruction of the temple, the loss of their commonwealth, the dissolution of their cult, their sacrificial practices, their priesthood, the elevation of their nascent interpretive teaching culture around Torah, that is to say the Pharisaic culture, which would later become the culture or the milieu of the rabbis. Again, another failed insurrection and even harsher consequences imposed by the Romans on the Jews after the Bar Kokhba revolt. All of that is context and milieu for an overarching view in Pirkei Avot of a kind of rigorous piety that is imposed on the young student and manifests in teachings such as the one we looked at last week, that if you are walking along while praying and you pause to acknowledge what a beautiful tree or what a finely plowed field, you have forfeited your life, right? So that's the context in which Hanina ben Dosa comes along, and he says something that I find, again, in that context, rather refreshing. He says, boy chicks, there is an extent to which sequestering oneself in a life entirely oriented toward pleasing God, the way the Jewish tradition understands how we please God, which is through prayer, formally sacrifice, through worship, through study, especially through study of Torah, without paying attention to the dynamic of you are a human being who functions in a society with other human beings, is actually to get the life / God balance wrong. Right, so there's something to be said for a healthy corrective, again, in the context of the wider chapter 3 of Pirkei Avot especially, but everything we've read so far, to say, do not think that all that God needs from you is a life where all you think about and the only one you serve is God. You also have to be a mensch. You also have to practice derech eretz. You also have to earn your way in the world. And by the way, I would say that if one wanted to get a little sneak up to the line of discomfort and bring up something very contemporaneous for us that would potentially relate to this teaching, look at how the Haredi are viewed in Israel, especially in light of this. You know, the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox, may be reasonably accused of spending all of their time and energy on serving God to the absolute ire of their fellow human beings outside of their Orthodox community. Obviously, within the Orthodox community, there is a deep sense of interconnectedness, mutual responsibility, and social welfare. But between ultra-Orthodox enclaves, and they really are designed and preserved to be enclaves, and the rest of the world, the ultra-Orthodox are viewed by many, particularly those who are not ultra-Orthodox, with extreme levels of disdain. And it may be possible, without wishing to disparage, for me or others to say, but I do so cautiously again, that they have brought a lot of that on themselves by not focusing or by not paying any heed to the interrelationship between themselves and wider society, and thinking only about God, God, God all day long, and my service to God and my study of Torah exempts me from, for instance, serving in the army, because by studying I'm actually inviting divine protection on the state of Israel. That's how I'll protect the Jewish people. I won't actually learn how to operate a ballistics battery. You know, these are real issues, particularly for Israelis, and how they deal with the ultra-Orthodox in their communities. So I just want to say, maybe in the context of the wider chapter 3 of Pirkei Avot, this is saying, yes, and a life of piety, a life where God is at the center, is what we all strive to achieve, and at the same time, be a mensch, in the literal sense of mensch, a man, be a person. Okay, thank you for the thumbs up. All right, Rashi was a vintner. Yeah, right, Steve, I think I understand your point there. Do you want to elaborate? Well, I'll elaborate for you. And by the way, Mazel Tov on what, your 136th half marathon? I think I saw that online. That's extraordinary. Rashi, yeah, most rabbis throughout history have had other jobs, right? They can't be God, God, God all day long, every night and every day. They actually have to make a living. They have to function in the quote-unquote real world among other men and women. And 131st half marathon. Thanks, Steve. And Michelle Braun commented here what she recalls, which you can share.
Well, I've got a couple of things. First of all, I think it's been my primary point has been made, and that is there's a context normative of what is how you will be liked, respected, acted in the community, relied very much on a strict adherence to the mitzvot, and the mitzvot were specified. Now, interpretation may have changed over the time, but there continues to be a set of things that you're supposed to do. And it's not just, hey, I really like this person, and it might actually rule out the earlier question about a well-liked tyrant, because there is a set of standards.
Right.
But I think that's, anyway, the second thing that is back to Rashi raising grapes. I mean, it helps that he lived in France. Maimonides, of course, we're talking very different, 800, 900 years after this text was written.
Yeah.
Maimonides irritates the daylights out of me, if I understood him, but in the few things he's written that are actually fairly, shall I say, plain English, he very much says, this is what you have to do. And the way you should spend your life is something like, studying philosophy, reviewing the texts until you know them, and then studying philosophy. And this is how you dedicate your life. Except that Maimonides himself was a physician and a counselor to the king or vizier, sultan, and did all of these other things. But that's not reflected in his writings and his preaching. So the question is how you apply those.
Beautiful. Yeah, beautifully put. And I think makes a strong case for the fact that this is not without moral evaluation. Right? It really isn't just about a popularity contest. Okay, I think we've established a lot of the points that could be made around this text. Let's continue with another guy who includes the name Dosa, though nothing is known about this rabbi except that he's probably roughly contemporaneous with Hanina ben Dosa. This is Rabbi Dosa ben Harkinas. And let's see what he has to say. This is fun. And again, I'm going to kind of encourage us to play around and see if we can connect the dots. What does this have to do with the statements that have just come before? Rabbi Dosa ben Harkinas Omer, he says, Shena shel shacharit, so literally morning sleep, right? Shacharit is also, that's a very well-chosen word. He doesn't just say sleep during the boker, which is the conventional word for morning. He says if you are sleeping during shacharit. So there's a possible pun or a double entendre here of sleeping during shacharit. Shacharit literally means the dawn, or the first pillar of dawn's light that emerges over the horizon as the sun is rising. Even before you can see the disk of the sun, right? If you stay up for sunrise, there's a pillar of light that begins to creep up on the horizon, and then eventually the circle of the sun will arise. And if you get if you have a really good sea level horizon, like looking out over the ocean, you can see this happen in the morning. So it is also, of course, however, the name of the morning service. It's the morning worship service, is shacharit or shachris. So one who is sleeping during shacharit, either the time or the service, and yayin. Yayin's a word that a lot of us are familiar with. Yayin is wine. Yayin shel tzohorayim, wine in the middle of the afternoon, or any time in the afternoon. Sichat hayeladim, children's conversation, not just children's talk, but presumably kiddie talk. Sichat hayeladim, vishivat batei chnesiot shel amei haaretz, and hanging around or sitting in the batei knesiot, literally the assemblies, a beit knesset, singular, batei knesiot, plural or double plural, literally the houses of the assemblies. So singular is a beit knesset, nothing to do with the Knesset that is the Israeli parliament, by the way. So beit knesset is a synagogue these days. But in the Mishnaic period, beit knesset simply meant like a town hall, which it was associated with the synagogue at this point. But synagogues, well before they became firmly and perhaps primarily associated with Jewish houses of worship, were used for conducting Jewish communal business. So it was more like a JCC. It was both social, political, civic, communal gathering place. And if you've been to any of the ruins of the ancient synagogues, including those from the Mishnaic period, there's plenty of archaeological evidence, including inscriptions from donors and configuration of rooms that archaeologists have unearthed that suggests exactly this, that it was much more than, and may not have even been at this point, a house of prayer. These days, if I refer to the Beit Knesset, I'm really talking about the synagogue entire, and especially the prayer house aspect of it. Don't get them confused. That is a much later association or connotation with Beit Knesset. Beit Knesset plural, a single Beit Knesset is a single synagogue, by the way. Batei Knesset, in construct form in Hebrew means houses of prayer or houses of assembly, synagogues. And batei knesiot means houses of assemblies. So multiple assemblies in multiple such houses. Vishivat, like yeshiva, but from shevet, like shevet achim gam yachad, sitting around, hanging out in batei knesiot shel amei haaretz, the hoi polloi, or even more, the common folk. Here they go even farther with the somewhat disparaging word, the assemblies of the ignorant. Okay, I don't think it is quite so heavily and negatively weighted in the literal translation. Amei haaretz literally means the people of the earth, but they're the common laborers. All of these things, sleeping during shacharit, wine during the afternoon, children's conversation, and sitting in the assemblies of the commoners, motzi'in, like motzi lechem min haaretz, to draw out or withdraw et ha'adam, that's a word that does mean person all the time, withdraws the person or a person, min ha'olam, from the world. But olam is another word with multiple meanings, and olam often means not just the temporal or the spatial physical world in geography, but olam also connotes eternity or time, as in leolam va'ed, which never refers to space or place. Olam, always in leolam va'ed, means forever and ever, or what is it that Buzz Lightyear says in the Toy Story Pixar movies? To infinity and beyond. That's leolam va'ed. So leolam va'ed is temporal. Nevertheless, so we've got again one of these great phrases that the Mishnah uses, like, it's just up to you to figure out what I mean. Engage in these activities. Sleep during the morning or sleep during shacharit, wine in the afternoon, children's conversation, and hanging out in the assembly of commoners. Motzi'in et ha'adam min ha'olam. They remove a person from the olam. Not the olam haba, by the way, just in case your mind is going to another common phrase that we will be talking about. When the Mishnah wants to talk about the hereafter, or the afterlife, it adds the word haba to the Hebrew word olam. So olam means the world, but it can also mean the temporal world as well as the spatial world. When it means the hereafter, the afterlife, or the next reality that awaits after the grave, or after death, the olam haba is usually the term that is used in rabbinic Hebrew, and that means the next world, or the next phase of existence, using olam not as a place. World almost always means place in English. Realm might be a little bit better, but realm is also more of a spatial word. Again, now I'm exercising, or I'm flexing some of those muscles I described earlier, that in English there's usually one best word. So I don't love world, I don't love realm. Maybe dimension. That's a good synonym for olam in this context, or olam haba would be the next dimension, the next phase. Phase is a temporal word, right? Phase, it can also be, you can also have physical phases. Like, I think water has they're called phases in science. There's solid, liquid, and gas. So that's phase as applied to matter. But usually when I think of how we use the word phase, it's a time word. Now and future. So the next phase is the olam haba. In this case, it simply says, these activities remove a person from the olam. Okay, what do you think of all of this? Your turn to comment. That's very funny. These are what proto-rabbis, not funny, it's great, Michelle. These are the things a proto-rabbi needs to do, or needs to avoid more specifically, to earn good reviews from man and God. Right, okay, so maybe that's that you're looking for the connection. Good for you. Right, if you want to earn the favor of humankind and not just any people, not the popularity contest, but the favor of the righteous, the favor of the mitzvah doers, the favor, as Russell proposes, of those who are leaning into or who are maximizing their divine potential, hence ruach habriot, and not just any old word for people such as Adam or Ish. If you want that, and therefore, and thereby to curry or earn is better than curry, divine favor, if you want that, then here are 3 things or 4 things to avoid. Don't sleep away your morning, particularly shacharit, which again has the don't sleep through the morning service, even though it's dawn. Don't drink wine in the afternoon. Don't hang out conversing with little kiddies. Or don't engage in infantile or juvenile conversation. That's a legit translation that I don't think is merely idiomatic. I think that's a good literal translation. Don't engage in sichata yiladim, the phrase that they translate as children's talk, could literally mean a conversation of or by children, or it can mean childlike conversation. It could simply mean juvenile. That's a totally legit, faithful, literal translation would be, do not engage in infantile or pediatric conversation. This is just some inside baseball about WRT clergy staff meetings. We are often using the words pediatric to refer to what we would like to avoid for almost any kind of engagement at the temple. Like if we're thinking about, okay, we've got a Friday night service, and we're also going to do a consecration ritual for our youngest learners. How can we have a service where Steve Siegel, I love you, Steve, where Steve Siegel does not come up to me afterward and say, you know, that was awfully pediatric. Right? So we're not trying to teach pediatric Judaism. On the other hand, we are trying to create family-friendly encounters with the Jewish tradition. It's a very hard tightrope to walk sometimes. And I am aware, especially through this teaching, that there's a much rabbinic wisdom to say about don't engage in pediatric Jewish conversation. There are important conversations to be had. And finally, hanging out with commoners. All of these things, motzi'in et ha'adam min ha'olam, they can remove a person from the world. Yeah, Audrey writes a great comment here. I have found that children are usually more uninhibited than adults and often speak truth, which should be considered. I would only correct that to say always and not often. You know, there used to be this great recurring sketch on Saturday Night Live. It was called Deep Thoughts by Jack Handy. Jack Handy was a writer for SNL, and he's written a number of hilarious books where he's collected these wise sayings called Deep Thoughts. Here's one of my favorites. Deep Thoughts by Jack Handy. The face of a child can say it all, especially the mouth part of the face. So there are many of these which are great. I love that one. What's another one I liked? Now I'm engaging in pediatric conversation, but here's another one for you. Consider the daffodil. And while you're doing that, I'll be over here looking through your stuff. There's a whole bunch. I memorized a lot of them. Another one. If it is true that God lives within us, as some say God does, I sure hope he likes enchiladas, because that's what he's getting. Okay, anyway, that's Deep Thoughts by Jack Handy. Any other comments on the 4 things that remove a person from the world? All right, let's go on then. Yes, I think what they have in mind is frivolity is to be avoided. Just in case you thought this was all about, just become a mensch or a popular person. No. Trish, you had a hand up. Why don't you chime in before we move on, please? Trish and David. Paging Trish and David.
Yeah, I just, I unmuted myself, right?
Great, yes.
I lowered my hand because you pretty much said, frivolity is what they all have in common. When I see lists like this, I always wonder why those things in particular. What was this guy thinking about that those are the things that he wanted to put in this list?
Right.
There's a whole universe of things you could put in a list like that. Why these?
Yeah, I'm with you.
That's all I was thinking.
I'm with you. Yep. Russell?
Unless I'm relying too literally on the translation, the first 3 of those are frivolity, but the 4th is not.
Fair point.
Spending time with common people. That's nothing frivolous unless you, like the Haredi, believe that anything that is mundane, like working for a living, is a distraction from God's real purpose.
Yeah, great.
And so I would wish to make that distinction again, unless it's an issue of
No,
translation.
no. I don't think it's an issue of translation. I think that's fair. It's also interesting that it seems like an add-on only because the rabbis, and we've seen this throughout Pirkei Avot, I talked about it a lot last semester and the previous semester, last year, last Jewish year. The rabbis speak in threes. Threes are good mnemonics. So it could well be that he's like, oh, and by the way, here's one that doesn't quite fit the others, but also stay away from, just common people and their common discourse. Steve Maskett.
I'm always thinking about whether there's a political aspect to this from the Mishnaic times, and the reference to people of the earth made me think about the battle, sort of the battle that existed between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, where the Sadducees had the farmers, and so they had the people, and that's what kept them in power, and the Pharisees, or the proto-rabbis, were more the urban. No, urban is
Urban or
small,
urbane, perhaps.
very small urban groups, where people. But so I was wondering whether that was sort of a reference of sort of a partisanship.
Could well be that that's reflective of fissures and competing or conflicting loyalties within ancient Jewish society. Intra-Jewish, by the way. We have talked in previous sessions recently about the interchange between the Jew and the non-Jew in Mishnaic period society. It is also important to raise the, I think, entirely plausible, but well corroborated conjecture that there were intra-Jewish tensions as well. That, see, what I don't know are the axes, right? The vectors along which those tensions might have cropped up. But urban versus rural, or urbane versus provincial, is entirely a plausible conjecture as I see it. Right? And
Craftsmen versus
we
farmers.
can't know. Pardon?
Craftsmen versus farmers.
There you go. Right. And these are tensions that are, of course, in evidence in all sorts of societies, not only ancient, including our own. One could, I think, make a very cogent argument. Mine will not be so cogent because it is not rigorously backed up, but one could make a very cogent argument that one of the most salient vectors along which the political conflict in the United States can be understood is urban versus rural, or those who make versus those who occupy somewhat less manufacturing echelons in society. The economy is no longer driven by an America that makes things. Okay, let's go on. There's a comment. Yes, Adam min ha'olam. Adam is one of the many words that can mean a person or people, and it comes with its own shades of meaning, and also is associated with the first Adam, though generally we may be overreading it if we make too much out of any of these words for referring to people. I made a whole lot of Ruach HaBriot. I would make less of Adam just because it's almost always used just to mean a person. Okay. Here we go with the next Mishnah. That was just one Mishnah. This one won't take as long. Oh no, it will. It's number 12 that won't take long. Okay, Rabbi Elazar Hamodai. So we've actually met Elazar Hamodai, just as a refresher. He was a student of Rabban Gamliel, they say here, from around 110 to 135, the fourth generation of the Tanaim. Student of Rabban Gamliel, influential preacher of the next generation. He was Bar Kokhba's uncle, but disagreed with the revolt against Rome that was led by Shimon Bar Koziba, later Bar Kokhba. Taking advantage, the Romans fomented intrigue, which led to Rabbi Elazar's death at the hands of his nephew. So he was actually murdered by Bar Kokhba. Lots of intrigue there. He said, one who profanes sacred things, let's look at the Hebrew, hamichalel, chilel, or lichalel is with a chet, there's the chet here, is a Hebrew word that means to desecrate or profane. Hamichalel et hakodashim, that's the word kodashim. So if you profane that which is sacred, and we can talk about what specifically that's referring to, and hamivazeh, one who spurns or despises, they use the word, but spurns is just as good. Et hamoadot, the seasonal times. Moed is the rabbinic word meaning an appointed time, generally for a festival. So if you spurn the festivals, profane the sacred things, and the third thing here, the hamalbin, hamalbin, from the Hebrew root lamed bet nun, meaning white, lavan, right? Some of you know that. Lavan means white, as in the old Israeli song Kachol v'Lavan, blue and white, or the blue and white, referring, of course, to the colors of Israel and the colors of the Israeli flag. A very old, patriotic, pre-statehood Jewish song. The Hamalbin, Penei Chavero Barabim, anyone who whitens the face of his companion or fellow in public or among the masses. Here, however, they actually use the word to blush, which would be to redden. We would actually, the better translate is causes his friend's face to blanch. Not blush, but blanch. See? English. Different words for different meanings. Nevertheless, whether you are talking about making a person's face blanch or blush, the idea is the same, right? You are causing that person public humiliation. That's the meaning here. And another one, V'hamefer brito shel Avraham Avinu alav hashalom, and anyone who annuls, again, or spurns, invalidates the brit, there's the word brit, Dad, the covenant of Abraham our father, Avraham Avinu, alav hashalom, may peace be upon him, and hamigale panim batorah shelo kehalacha, anyone who is contemptuous of the Torah, though the word literally means to reveal the face of the Torah, shelo kehalacha, without respect for the law. So that's a very complex phrase to unpack, and they translate it as best as they can idiomatically here. They render it as anyone who's contemptuous of the Torah. I would say, V'hamigale panim b'Torah shelo kehalacha, anyone who interprets the Torah not in accordance with the halacha. Oops, I'm guilty. This guy, who has two thumbs and interprets the Torah sometimes out of sync with what the halacha says. This guy. Right, yeah. Okay, we'll come back to that. Anyone who is contemptuous toward the Torah. I like my translation better, though. Anyone who interprets the Torah, who literally unrolls the Torah, or exposes the Torah, migale panim b'Torah shelo kehalacha, in a way that is not consistent with Jewish law, af al pi, which means despite the fact, even though, sheyesh biyado Torah u'ma'asim tovim, even if he is very learned, literally he has much Torah, he has Torah in his hands, so even if he's a master of Torah, and he also possesses ma'asim tovim, which are good deeds. So even if he's a righteous person who is very learned, if he unrolls and exposes Torah, or I would say interprets Torah, in a manner that is inconsistent with halakha, even if he is both learned and righteous, ein lo chelek la'olam haba, and I knew that phrase was coming, which is why I gave you a longer description of it in the previous explication, that person will not have a share in the world to come. He has no portion in the next phase. Whoa, Nelly, that is quite a Mishnah. Similar format to what has come before, right? Here are some things you would like to avoid, because if you do them, you will exempt yourself from, not from this world, but from the next. not from this phase of existence, but from the next. And that's interesting too. We could now unpack the difference between the two cautions, right? Okay, so going back one Mishnah, just by compare and contrast, right? I want you to see this because I think it's relevant. The one above say that if you do these certain things, these behaviors to be avoided, as Michelle pointed out, then you remove yourself from this world. Sleeping all morning or sleeping through shacharit, drinking wine early in the afternoon, pediatric conversation, and hanging out with commoners in their places of assembly, you are removed from this world. But if you profane that which is sanctified, and that usually means sacrificial offerings or things that you would vow as a donation to the temple or to the religious establishment, the Jewish establishment. So it could be, in our context, it would be like tzedakah, but in the biblical context, it was probably the animal sacrifices. You would desecrate the animals or in some way not provide the unblemished, perfect specimens that the Torah requires for your sacrificial offerings. Some way of profaning your sacred offerings, and despises the festivals. That just probably means that you either don't observe, don't celebrate, or even more, you are actively choosing to work on the Sabbath and the holidays. That's a fairly straightforward understanding. That phrase comes up a lot. To spurn or despise the festivals is almost always associated with working on the Sabbath and the Chagim, which is a big no-no. And one who causes public embarrassment, or literally blanches his fellow's face in the presence of others. Elsewhere in the Talmud, by the way, very interesting, they do talk about causing one's face to turn red, and they say that that is why humiliating your fellow in the Jewish tradition is tantamount to bloodshed and is a capital offense because it causes blood to come to the face. Therefore, it is like bloodshed. Humiliating one's fellow intentionally, deliberately, is among the gravest offenses in the Jewish tradition. And my teacher and many of your teachers, many of yours, Rabbi Jack Stern, alav shalom, may peace be upon him, often, like I've gone back and read Jack's sermons many, many times, he often references the grave sin of causing embarrassment to another human being. I think it was one of his master themes throughout his entire rabbinic career in his preaching. Frequently references the gravity in Judaism of causing another person humiliation. Words that need to be heard now more than ever, unfortunately. And one who annuls the covenant of our father Abraham. Anyone guessing? Just this is pretty. This is a not a fastball. This one's pretty over the plate. What would it mean to annul the covenant of one's father Abraham, peace be upon him? What behavior is being proscribed here?
Circumcision?
Or yeah, failure to circumcise. Right? So not circumcising oneself, or more likely one's male children, one's household. And then finally the last one is that really complicated phrase about what they translated as being contemptuous of Torah, but I have a more nuanced way of translating that, I believe, which is one who interprets Torah not in concordance or not consistent with the halacha, with Jewish law, even if that person is both righteous and learned. All of these behaviors remove a person not from the olam, not from this world, but from the olam haba. Okay, so I wanted us to look at these texts both individually and also side by side and figure out what we can make of them. You can comment here at will, and especially if you have a comment that helps us understand why certain behaviors to be avoided extract a person from this world, and other behaviors to be avoided extract a person from the world to come, I would be especially gratified to hear it, as would your classmates. Okay, a couple hands are up. Let's start with my parents have a hand up, and Russell, you have a hand up.
Derek Eretz Keneged Torah.
Kadma LaTorah. Derech Eretz.
Kadma.
Common courtesy comes before or precedes, in not just in chronology but in importance, Torah.
And that's where I think the second passage is headed.
Say more.
Well, it goes to the way we treat each other. The first one, the first was more personal failings, like I had a glass of wine at lunch, I slept through services, I talked Narishkeit with my friends, etc. No great harm from that. But as you pointed out, causing public embarrassment to another person, and the covenant of Abraham was not all and only about circumcision, but about greeting strangers and visiting the sick, and other parts of the covenant of Abraham. These are things that really reflect the right way to behave in the world.
Great. Excellent. Let's hear more. Russell.
This impresses me as the perfect storm of damnation, because it takes one embarrassing your fellow man goes back to your human interactions. It goes back to what we were talking before about how God despises those who are despised by their fellow man, and God loves those who are loved by their fellow man. Your social breaching that social covenant is a source of being cut off from the eternity. At the same time, an impure moral heart, an impure, the misinterpretation of Torah, for example, is an impure moral or spiritual heart. And that leads to the same consequence. And then defying the authority of the rabbis and the religious order leads you to that. So all three of the things that you could possibly mess up in your life are right there. And as I mentioned in the chat, it takes a very sort of Calvinistic view of this because it suggests that the way to earn that eternal benefit is to do the opposite. So I wonder how consistent this is with the rest of our non-Calvinistic theology.
Right, and of course you're using that anachronistically, Calvinism not coming along for quite some time after Pirkei Avot, but fair enough.
I have to tell everyone, I'm a huge fan of Calvinism, and especially the American Calvinistic sermons of the 1600s that said things like "man returns to his sins like a dog to his vomit." I mean, that it's better than Jack Candy.
I am well aware of this predilection of yours, Russell, and all I can say is that I am even more of a fan of the cartoon Calvin and Hobbes. By the way, tell us what your backdrop is today.
This is the interior of the Centre Louis Vuitton in Paris, in the Bois de Boulogne.
Fun. So I want to add, so thank you. In addition to my dad's comment, now I want us to kind of retract the lens a little bit or zoom out and notice that the first set of offenses or behaviors to be avoided have a kind of mostly significant consequence for the individual who is doing those things. Oh, I slept through services. Well, my loss, my bad. I had some wine after lunch, which made me sluggish and unproductive. I am principally the one affected by this choice. I engaged in pediatric conversation. Okay, I missed the opportunity to study and learn Torah or to be in closer communion with the divine. And finally, the last one in that first set was I hung out with common folks. Again, my time was not particularly well spent. Therefore, I am motzi'in min ha'olam. I am withdrawn or distanced, would be another good word, from ha'olam, this world. The second set of behaviors, Russell, you used a word a few times, which is the community, or the relationship between the self and the other, is described with graver consequences, not only for the one doing the proscribed behaviors, but somebody else is getting hurt in the process. And I think that's a really important distinction that one can make, and you alluded to this in your comment, that whether it is, and I'll bring the text up on screen so we can actually see those things, and also so I don't have to rely on my memory to get all four of them right. To profane sacred things, right? Sacrificial offerings, well, that also means that in a biblical context, the priest was not able to enjoy the meal because presumably its kosher status could have been invalidated. So the priest, at least the priest and possibly the poor, if a person just chose not to bring a sacrifice, he is depriving other people of their opportunity, to say nothing of the offense to God. A crime between, you remember what is said on Yom Kippur, sins between a person and God, the Day of Atonement, for sins between a person and God, the Day of Atonement atones. In other words, you're covered if you allow yourself to be open to Yom Kippur. But for sins between Yom Kippur, between a person rather and another person, the Day of Atonement does not atone until one has made peace with one's fellow. Right? These are about things that have a deleterious effect on another person, a community, or a relationship. One who despises the festivals, you might say, no, that's all on the doer or the non-doer. I choose not to show up for Sukkot, that's all my loss. But there might be an alternate interpretation, one that I like here, particularly as a congregational rabbi, that anytime a person chooses not to engage in the communal life of the Jewish festivals and Shabbatot and seasons, the entire community experience is diminished. Causing one's fellow's face to blanch or blush, that's the most obvious. That is a grave offense likened elsewhere in the rabbinic literature to bloodshed. Not circumcising your son, well, again, you might say, hey, that's just between me and my family. And Judaism would say, no, that is actually causing harm to the glue that keeps us covenantally bound as a community. And then finally, one who is contemptuous toward the Torah, or my preferred translation, one who interprets Torah in a way that is out of step with Jewish law, you are actively working toward the dissolution of Jewish communal integrity. All of these things that are harmful to another person or to the integrity of the Jewish people as a collective, and the Jewish community and the Jewish tradition, in a way, those are spiritually more grave offenses associated with the punishment of not having a share in the world to come. They may not affect you in the here and now. You may be able to get away with these things without much consequence to your life, well-being, and ability to participate when and how you like in Jewish communal affairs. But the rabbis want to suggest that they come with a spiritually grave penalty. Michelle.
Okay, being in a nitpicky mood today, I just wanted to observe that although you, Jonathan, might, and all of us, but we're not official in the community leaders, most of us, we may all be violating the interpretation in light of consistent with that, but the conjunction here is and. So it's possible one has to blow all of them, not any of them.
Nice. Good. Thank you. I feel better. Skip a Sukkot service once, you're still fine. Skip a Sukkot service, fail to circumcise your child, humiliate another person in public, and interpret the Torah in wildly disjunctive ways vis-a-vis the Jewish law, and you're really screwed. But that's great, Michelle. Thank you. We have a couple of other, I think, nice comments. First of all, kudos. Steve Siegel, 33,000 miles. I just want to say that's 3 times as many as on my car right now. That's incredible. And you're right. The sacrifices were ended by 70 CE, but sometimes the rabbis speak in a way as if they were very much still with us. Not for nothing is there are entire tractates of the Talmud devoted to the proper way of offering sacrifices, even though the Talmud arose in a post-sacrificial milieu entirely. There is not one rabbinic opinion recorded in the Talmud that is contemporaneous with the cult of sacrifice, except for some like Hanina Bendosa who may have lived at the tail end of temple days. But it is a sacred collective recollection of temple practice, and it is still sacrificial worship that informs a vast number of significant mitzvot of Jewish significance, even after the temple and the sacrificial cult were long since abandoned. Okay. And Audrey makes a nice comment too, that it is bothersome to place observance of ritual above learning and doing mitzvot. In the case of the person who has great learning and even righteous deeds to his credit, but who interprets the Torah out of step with Jewish law. But again, just remember who's talking, by whom, to whom. These rabbis have a vested interest in the continuity of the Jewish tradition as mediated through law. So I would have probably been cast out of favor early and often were I in the ancient yeshiva. But then I can't put myself in this milieu. My rabbinic upbringing, my family upbringing, my synagogue upbringing all suggest that I am an indigenous product of the Reform movement. And I've had much exposure to and comfort within conservative and even Orthodox Jewish settings. I'm just saying that I am most at home as a Reform rabbi. I don't know anything else other than being a Reform rabbi, and therefore I am totally at home with providing interpretations of the tradition that may or may not be consistent with halacha. Let's go on. The next one is brief in the extreme, and we'll be able to cover it briefly. Rabbi Ishmael Omer, he says, very tricky phrase though up top. Heve kal rosh. Does anyone know what the word kal means? Shout it out if you know what kal is in Hebrew. I'll give you a hint. It's an easy word. Don't look at the English translation. It won't get you anywhere. Kal is an easy word. What does kal mean? Kal means easy. I was giving you the answer. Kal is an easy word. Kal means easy. It also means light or lightweight or lesser. Remember what I said at the beginning of class, that normatively in the Hebrew language, single words carry expansive multiple meanings. To have multiple words to convey individual nuances is not normative, but we do have that in the case of teaching, learning, law, justice, ethics, righteousness, etc. But for most words, kal can mean easy, light, less, lesser, least. It can also mean lighthearted, lightheaded, levity. All of these words are, legitimately, you can use kal to connote all of those. It is most famously used in a rabbinic hermeneutic known as kal vachomer. Some of you may have heard of kal vachomer. It's a very important hermeneutic. Don't get too bogged down in my fancy words. Hermeneutic simply means a literary device by which meaning is constructed or conveyed. It is a method or a mechanism for interpreting text. It comes from the Greek god Hermes. Hermes, or Apollo in the Roman nomenclature, was the messenger god, the one whose main job was to shuttle between the realm of the gods in Olympia and the realm of human beings down here on earth. Hermes, the messenger. Hermeneutics is the set of mechanisms or methods that shuttle between a word or a text and its meaning. The word or the text, as it were, is in the realm of the gods. Its meaning, that which we understand about that word or text, is what we carry here in the terrestrial realm. So a hermeneutic, like Hermes, shuttles between a text or a word and the way we understand it. And if you're a rabbi, there are very specific methods or mechanisms or hermeneutics for deriving meaning from a text. There are also some which are out of bounds. You can't just say anything means anything. When you get into that, you get into folks like 20th century philosophers or linguistic experts, or not linguistics-oriented meaning makers like Jacques Derrida, who basically says that most of the meaning of a text is yeah, I see thumbs down from Russell. Okay. Still a lawyer, I get it. But Jacques Derrida basically says if you want to know what a text means, the answer is nothing intrinsically, everything in the eyes of the reader. That's a really bad but functional summation of how Derrida could be brought to bear on this conversation. In any case, hermeneutics. Let me give you an example. This week in the Torah, we are reading about the binding of Isaac. Yes, we read it on Rosh Hashanah. It is this week's Parsha, though, Vayera. What is the last thing that happens in the story of the binding of Isaac? Russell?
They go off to Beersheba.
Right. Or
Not they.
Not they, but Michelle?
Abraham and his couple of servants.
Right.
Yeah.
Abraham and the servants return. He goes to Beersheba. Isaac is not seen. Isaac goes off alone, presumably. And what is the very thing that happens in the very first verse of next week's Parsha? Steve Siegel, you know the answer. You asked the question, where is Sarah? Presumably back home, but the next we learn about Sarah is the very first verse of the Parsha that begins Saturday night, Sunday morning, Chaye Sarah, which is that Sarah dies. Because these passages are adjacent, and because in the rabbinic imagination, or in the rabbinic hermeneutics of making meaning out of a text, adjacency can provide causality. Bear with me on this. Adjacency for the rabbis can imply or provide causality. In other words, if two passages, even if they were composed by two completely different, the rabbis didn't believe in composite authorship of the Torah the way I do. It's not a question of belief, it's true. If two passages are adjacent, then they can be understood as causal, the first of the second. Therefore, let me now ask you, be like the ancient rabbis. Why did Sarah die? Russell.
Well, apart from being 10,000 years old at the time,
Right.
Yes. Abraham took her only son off on a little camping trip,
and he never returned.
And he's gone.
That's right. Exactly right. And there is an ocean of ink spilled in exactly that interpretive direction in the rabbinic literature. Now, again, we modern readers can say, no, they have nothing to do with each other. It's just that there are two different stories, probably written by two different authors at two completely different times, in two different contexts. One story is about the binding of Isaac, the next story is about the death of Sarah, and some later redactor put them in this order because they make sense chronologically. But for the rabbis, causality is always something they seek in the text. Why did Sarah die? Why was Abraham chosen to go Lech Lecha, to go forward? All of these, the rabbis want to know, and especially when the text doesn't give you a direct answer, the rabbis will find a way to get that meaning through rabbinic hermeneutics. So what is called in Hebrew smichut, or simuchin, which means adjacency. When two things are touching, they are samuch in Hebrew. Adjacent means causal for the rabbis, if and when they want it to. Joe Levine, comment? No. Okay. So what I would want to suggest here is, this is a very long digression, but Kal v'chomer is another hermeneutic, literally from the light to the heavy. It is a interpretive device, aka a hermeneutic of meaning making, wherein one can draw a conclusion that if such and so is the consequence of something light or mild or modest happening, then how much the more so for something similar but heavier. Kal v'chomer hermeneutics pop up all the time in the Passover Haggadah. If you read if you're really doing a serious Seder, and you get to the part where there's a lot of rabbinic math, if God's hand, as the Torah tells us, sent the 10 plagues, how much the more so were the Israelites or were the Egyptians afflicted because a hand has 5 fingers, right? So if a single hand can send 10 plagues, what about both hands of God? And you have that whole fourfold 500 plagues. Like it gets crazy. But that's a kal vachomer. If X for the light, then X plus or X squared for the heavy. Kal means light. That's the longest digression for 2 letters in Hebrew. Kuf lamed. Dad, comment.
I just wanted to share how this came up in a recent email exchange I had with a longtime friend of mine who's a PhD professor of English at UNC Asheville. And he made some comment that I hadn't read Bartleby the Scrivener among a bunch of other books. And I took umbrage. Yeah. And I took umbrage at that, thinking that, man, I'm a pretty well-read doctor. If you don't think that I'm well-read, what must you think?
There it is.
Other physician colleagues who generally are not that well-read.
If Doug Blake can be disparaged as an ignoramus, how much the more so somebody who lacks the learning of a Doug Blake? That's kal vachomer. Excellent. Thank you. You've given us a very real-life example. And now you can say to your august and learned friend something that he won't understand about kal vachomer and see if you can trip him up. But he's a smart guy. He's been on our class, by the way, your friend Jay. I hope he returns someday. Okay. But don't show him the recording of this class. Okay, now let me bring on screen the rest of this text because I'd like to get through it. We should be able to and then conclude. Okay. Heve kal l'rosh. Be, that's so hard to translate this. Kal means light or less than. Rosh means the head. This is your Rosh. But Rosh also means the head in the sense of Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year. Rosh can also mean anything that is superior, the alpha. So be lesser than the alpha. Or as they translate very idiomatically here, be suppliant to a superior. Suppliant in the sense of deliberately less than. Take, make yourself, I'm struggling for the right word here, as I sometimes do. Diminish yourself in your own eyes in the face of one who is your superior. Be subordinate, I think is the word I wanted. Be subordinate to your superior.
Self-effacing, maybe?
Self-effacing would be appropriate and contained within that. And Diane, did you have a comment there?
Subservient.
Subservient, nice. Put yourself in the position of less to the greater.
So
again-
suppliant suggests making a plea. though.
No, that's supplicant. And I had to look up the 2 words to confirm that there's a difference between them.
No,
I
I'm
thought
looking
the
up
same thing
suppliant.
is- Yeah, I thought that it was supplicant. And I even went
No,
back to make sure that it wasn't a
that's making a
mistranslation
plea.
because suppliant was not a word I had heard before. But a suppliant is actually one who is an inferior or a subordinate or subservient to a person who is superior. Okay, so be suppliant or inferior, subordinate to a superior. And then consistent with that comes the second phrase in this Mishnah, submissive under compulsory service. Literally submissive, though, it's the same word that we used above, by the way, in a person with whom God or man is pleased, was the word noach, which literally means to be comfortable with. Noach is actually the same as the word Noah. And in the same Calvinist period of preachers running all over the place, preaching about sin and its consequences that Russell referenced, you had a bunch of guys running around this country and Britain who were named Comfort. It's not a very common name these days. I don't think millennials have adopted the custom of naming their kids Comfort. But there were all sorts of names like that: Comfort, Faith, Hope, Generous Jones. I don't know.
Praise God.
Praise God is a name?
Praise God Barebones was the president of Oliver Cromwell's parliament, and he had a son named If Christ Had Not Lived, Thou Wouldst Be Damned, Barebones.
I am disappointed that of your 2 grandsons thus far, neither comes even close to a name like that. So, yeah. So we have names like Comfort, which is just the literal King Jamesian translation of Noah. Noah is comfort. So one should be suppliant or subordinate to one's rosh, that is to say, one who is a head above you, or ahead of you, ha ha ha, deliberate pun there. Submissive under compulsory service, very tricky word that no one's quite sure on what this Hebrew word tishchoret means, but it seems to me be at ease with the fact that you must serve a higher authority. Vehe mikabel et kol adam basimcha, and greet every person happily. Final comments for today before we conclude. Know your place in society. Seems reasonable wisdom for adolescent boys in a group setting as they journey on their way to leadership, but I'm not sure that there's much else that could be extracted from this. I'm happy to hear Michelle's thought, however.
No, it's actually completely consistent because the training model at the time of your yeshiva, when you were young, you may have taken classes and done other things, but in fact, to become a rabbi, you followed a fairly strict process of apprenticeship that included all the living with your rabbi, your teacher, and doing everything. So it might be following him on a trip and providing his food and cleaning the living room or the classroom, or
Right.
So it was an all-encompassing sort of thing. So this to me could very well be just, do as you're told.
Yeah, lovely, lovely, lovely. Next week, tithing, sexual licentiousness, and the many meanings of the word fences. Come back in a week. I bid you a gorgeous day. Enjoy the sunshine. If you stay inside all day, you're missing out. Let me flag two things that are happening tonight, just by way of good and welfare. And I'm not sure which is which. But tonight at 6 o'clock, I will be moderating a panel conversation, just a dialogue with Scott Richman, who is the New York, New Jersey Regional Director of the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL. It is open to you and all. The link is provided in this morning's e-blast from the temple or on the temple website. They are asking that you register in advance. That means only that they can give you a link so that the Zoom security will be as good as it can be. That takes place over Zoom at 6 o'clock this evening. Should be a robust conversation about the state of anti-Semitism today and how we individually and as a community can meet the challenges of the moment. The conversation will continue in person tomorrow, though you won't be at a deficit if you don't come to the Zoom event. Tomorrow at 5:30, Scott, who lives in Larchmont, will be joining me in the tent outside for services. And before services at 5:30, we'll have an in-person dialogue continuing the conversation from tonight. That's at 5:30 tomorrow. I hope you'll stay for services. Please do not wear dressy clothes for tomorrow night's service. We are going to be trying one more time to have an outdoor service in the tent. It's supposed to be lovely weather, maybe a little on the crisp end, but it should still be in the 60s in terms of degrees Fahrenheit. Jeans and sweaters are entirely appropriate, or khakis and a warm jacket. Come, we'll have some wonderful community, some wonderful camp-style music, and we have our entire 10th grade class joining us. The confirmation class is also part of the community tomorrow night. It would be really nice to see you at services outside tomorrow at 6:15, whether or not you come to the dialogue 45 minutes beforehand. Finally, for those of you who enjoy fun things like this, Kelly, my wife, makes her debut on Law and Order tonight. It's a few meaningful lines of dialogue, so it's a little bit of screen time. In an episode entitled The 500th Episode. It's the 500th episode of the Law and Order franchise. It's Law and Order SVU, airing tonight on NBC at 9 o'clock. All right, my friends. Goodbye.
Kol hakavod, Rabbi.
Thank you. Baruch tiyeh. Bye.
Also, thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.